Everybody, I'm Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a set of conversations about slavery, equality, and the American Revolution. Today's gathering is part of a large and ambitious project for us here at AI, and I want to say just a few words about it before we get started. Next year, 2026, will mark the 250th anniversary of the American founding. A lot of organizations are going to recognize that milestone birthday in a variety of ways. But in thinking about what kind of distinct contribution we here could make in particular, we thought that we should produce a lasting intellectual product through a set of conferences that will then yield a set of books and other educational materials that explore how Americans now should understand some of the key themes and questions at issue in our nation's founding. These materials can outlast the anniversary. They can serve educators and students and citizens for many years to come. And to do that, they'll draw on scholars from a variety of fields with a diversity of viewpoints to offer Americans some wisdom about our civic and political inheritance. So over the course of more than 2 years, we're hosting 8 scholarly conferences here at AI, each of which is devoted to a particular facet of the character and legacy of the American Revolution. We've had 4 of these already. The first considered democracy and the revolution. The second looked at some of the economic facets of the founding. The third looked at religion and the founding. And the fourth was about natural rights and the common good. Today's is the 5th of these gatherings. Each of them will result in a book of essays on its theme, as well as various other kinds of video and audio and digital media products. The first of the books from our first conference is out now. We have copies if you're interested, and the second will be out very soon. These books will then be gathered into a collection to be published in time for the July 4th, 2026 anniversary, and to be widely distributed as an educational and civic resource to public libraries, to college and high school teachers, and beyond. Our goal is really to create a kind of 21st century literature on the founding and to help inform and reinforce the growing movement to strengthen civic education and civic learning in America, a movement that's been building steam in some ways in recent years. In today's gathering, as in every one of these conferences, we are taking up a subject that demands careful thought, that will benefit from the attention of scholars from different disciplines with different views. And today's subject is, of course, essential and unavoidable to confront when we consider the aims and the realities of the American project. It's the source of some of the deepest skepticism about the founding and the deepest criticisms of it. But it also gets at the deepest aims of the founding and at its highest promise. It's about the tensions between the commitment to equality asserted in the American Revolution and the facts of brutal inequality and brutal inhumanity that characterized American life as lived in that time and that have continued to cast their effects into our time. The shadow of slavery does hang over the American founding, and just how we should understand the views of the founders toward slavery has itself been a crucial question from the start, and a source of division at key moments in American life, in the 19th century and in the 20th and in the 21st. So we're going to learn about this complicated and important set of questions with the help of 5 great scholars, really a kind of incredible all-star cast on this subject. We're going to do that in 2 panels. The first will be hosted and moderated by my colleague and co-editor of this project, Adam White. Adam is the Lawrence Silberman Chair in Constitutional Governance here at AI, a great scholar of the Constitution and the law, and he'll moderate a conversation between Randy Barnett, Justin Driver, and Kurt Lash. I'll then moderate our second panel, a conversation between Diana Schaub and Lucas Morel. We're tremendously grateful to all of them for being here, and to all of you for joining us. And with that, I'll turn over things to Adam.
Thank you very much, Yuval, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Our first panel is titled Created Equal. After affirming that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, the Declaration of Independence added that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. From the start, those words inspired Americans, but they also confronted Americans with the heartfelt conflict between our founding principles and the actual conditions of American life, especially the brutal facts of slavery. Decades later, after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments attempted once again to secure equality and liberty more soundly. Another century later, the Civil Rights Act tried once again. Yet even today, we see enormous disagreement over equality in our own time and in the founders' time. As we turn to these questions today, we're lucky to start the conversation with three keen scholars of American constitutional self-government. First, we'll hear from Randy Barnett. Randy is the Georgetown University Law Center's Patrick Ho-Tung Professor of Constitutional Law, and he directs the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. The author of many books on the Constitution's words and underlying principles, including 2016's Our Republican Constitution, Securing the Liberty and Sovereignty of We the People. Then we'll hear from Justin Driver. He's the Yale Law School's Robert Slaughter Professor of Law and a leading legal historian. 2018 saw publication of his book, The Schoolhouse Gate, Public Education, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for the American Mind. I'll add, we served together on President Biden's commission on the Supreme Court of the United States, because who doesn't love a group project? Finally, we'll hear from Kurt Lash. Kurt is the University of Richmond's E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Chair in Law. His many books include 2014's The 14th Amendment and the Privileges or Immunities of American Citizenship. In 2021, the University of Chicago Press published his 2-volume collection of original documents relating to the framing and ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, titled The Reconstruction Amendments, Essential Documents. So thanks again to all for joining us, and we'll begin with Professor Barnett.
Well, thank you, Adam, and thanks to Yuval and Adam for inviting me to be part of this very important project. The 250th anniversary of the Declaration and the founding of this country is extremely significant, because some people would think that our country was founded in 1789 with the Constitution, but that's not the case. The founding of this country took place in 1776, when we separated from Great Britain and became an independent polity as a result of an act of the Continental Congress to do that, and a declaration that was issued to explain and justify the departure from England and the creation of a new political entity called the United States of America. That was our founding. And at our founding, the Declaration stated the American theory of government. The American theory of government is, in one sentence, first come rights, and then comes government. And that is reflected in the famous words that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of certain inalienable rights. Among those are the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then the very next sentence, Adam has already quoted to you, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, telling you the status of government. Government is there to secure the pre-existing rights, unalienable rights of human beings, which are stated in the previous sentence as the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is what we found. That's how our country was founded. That is the American theory of government. But as soon as you mention it nowadays, the immediate response you're going to get in many quarters, including from my own students and from my own colleagues, and that would be, well, what about slavery? And that's the topic of the contribution I made to this collection. The title of it is, What About Slavery? And that requires us to reframe the framing, because this whole idea that we should view the framing through the lens of slavery has been an exercise in narrative control. The idea here is to delegitimate the founding of this country by associating it with a horrible evil, and thereby delegitimating the country today. We are fighting about the past because we're fighting about the present. So is this a fair characterization of the founding to say it was about slavery, it was irreconcilably tainted by slavery? And I think the answer to that is no. When I teach constitutional law, whether I'm teaching the structures course or I'm teaching the constitutional rights course at Georgetown, I do spend the first day on the founding, I do spend the first day on the Declaration, but then I spend the next 2 classes on slavery, because I do think it is the case. I don't do this gratuitously, I don't do this because it's trendy. I do it because I don't think you can understand the founding without understanding slavery. I don't think you can understand the form the Constitution took without understanding slavery, and you certainly can't understand how the Constitution came to be amended by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments without understanding slavery and its aftermath. And for that reason, I spent 2 classes, one on Prigg versus Pennsylvania, one on Dred Scott, and the surrounding materials, including studying anti-slavery constitutionalism, a subject that deserves far more serious attention than it gets from academics, much less from the general public, because doing so is essential to understanding the country, but not in a negative way. By and large, it's in a positive way. And so let me just run down a few facts that I think flip the narrative back to where it should have been, where it should be, where it used to be, and where it should be all along. And these facts are not contested by historians. They're simply facts that get de-emphasized and sometimes forgotten. So let me focus on the first fact, and that is in 1776, we had 13 colonies. It became 13 states. Every one of them had slavery. It was 100% slavery in 1776. But by the time the Constitution was written, some 11 years later, just 11 years later, 5 of those states had made moves, had already moved to abolish slavery, had abolished it, or had moved to abolish slavery. One of them had abolished slavery as a result of a Supreme Court ruling, and that's the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The Supreme Court held that slavery was unconstitutional in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So by the time the Constitution is drafted, 5 of the 13 states had already moved to abolish slavery. The 14th state, the state to join the Union next, Vermont, was founded as an independent republic in 1777, the year after, or within 6 months of the Declaration of Independence, and its constitution barred slavery. It was, historian Sean Wilentz tells us in his very important book, No Property in Man, it was the first constitution in the history of the world that abolished slavery. And that became our 14th state. So that brings us up to 6 states, then New York, then New Jersey moved to abolish slavery. Think about it. Slavery was universal in 1776. Slavery existed throughout all of human history. Slavery was not limited to the enslavement of African peoples. It included white people and all sorts of other people. Slavery was the norm. Here in the United States is where the anti-slavery movement began. In fact, the first anti-slavery organization or in the whole world, in the history of the world, was started in Philadelphia in 1775. It started here, and it kept going. So 11 years later, you have half the country on the path towards the complete abolition of slavery. Then you have the Constitution. So does the Constitution reflect this trend? And the answer is yes, it does. Because the Constitution refused to acknowledge slavery as a legal concept. It refused to acknowledge slavery as a principle. What it refused to acknowledge was the principle of property in man. And it was not because some of the deep southern states didn't try to get that language into the Constitution, because they did. But they were resisted at every turn by a coalition of northern states and Virginia. Without the Virginian support for this opposition, the Constitution might have acknowledged slavery, but it refused to do so. When it referred to slavery, it referred to it using euphemisms because it didn't want to dignify the trade by calling it by its name. It was also the expectation at that time, as many people will tell you or would say, that the institution of using chattel slavery was a dying institution, an economically dying institution. It would eventually wither away of its own volition. I think that was sometimes a bit of an over-optimistic take by some people, but that was one of the general expectations. And so as a result, the Constitution did not formally recognize slavery. If you fast forward to the Dred Scott opinion, where Chief Justice Taney is arguing why it is that someone who is born of African descent in this country could never be a natural-born citizen of the United States, he had to reckon with the words of the Declaration of Independence. And when he did, he acknowledged that were those words written today, meaning in 1856 or 1857, it would seem to encompass all of mankind. It would seem to encompass, those words would encompass everybody. But he said, but you have to put yourself back in the minds of the framers of the Constitution and to understand the poor condition of these sorry people and why it was taught at the time that they had no rights that white men were obligated to respect. So what he basically had to do is argue that the plain meaning or the public meaning of the words of the Declaration were clearly anti-slavery. Even he had to acknowledge that. But that the original intent of the framers at the Constitution was actually otherwise. And what I'm telling you is that was not the case, that there was a universal consensus that slavery was unjust and wrong at the time of the founding. And it's reflected in the words that were chosen to be in the Constitution. So what happened? What happened? Historians are pretty much agreed about what happened. What happened was the invention of the cotton gin, and then somewhat later, the invention of the steam engine. And what that meant was slavery on plantations, which had been relatively unprofitable and looked like it was going to die out because it was basically used to grow tobacco and other goods. It couldn't be used to grow cotton because it was too costly to separate this, economically, because it was too costly to separate the fibers from the seeds. But the cotton gin, a technological invention by Eli Whitney, if you put cotton balls in and you turn the crank, all of a sudden the fibers separated from the seeds. You can do it easily. And that meant you could grow cotton in great quantity. And at that point, slavery became enormously profitable. And then with the invention of the steam engine, the use of steamships to carry cotton upriver instead of downriver or up the coast, it also made it less expensive to bring cotton to market from the South. And because of these technological developments that happened 2 years after the Constitution, began happening 2 years after the Constitution was drafted, there suddenly grew up in this country a pro-slavery ideology, a powerful pro-slavery ideology that didn't exist when the Constitution was written. But it did exist. And in response to that grew up a pretty radical anti-slavery ideology as well. And then the issue was joined, and we all know what happened after that, leading to a very, very tumultuous and costly civil war in which slavery was eradicated. But the point here isn't what happened 2 years after the Constitution was written, which was itself written 11 years after the founding of this country. The key here is what the founding of this country was about. It was about inalienable natural rights of each and every person. It was acknowledged to be so, with the very expectation that if it could not be accomplished all at once, it would be accomplished gradually over time. And in fact, it started to be accomplished very rapidly over time. And I forgot one last fact, I'm sorry, of this narrative, because I know that I'm probably pressed for time here. But one last fact of this narrative, and I'm sorry I left this out because it actually blows your mind when you think about it. And that is the same summer that the Philadelphia Convention is deliberating in order to write the words of the Constitution. In Congress in New York, they're deliberating over what became the Northwest Ordinance. And that was the governance of all the territory that was north or west of the Ohio River. And that was the territory that became the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and parts of Michigan, and parts of Minnesota. It's a vast territory, the territory from which all future states foreseeably were going to be drawn from. And what did the Congress do with respect to those states in the Northwest Ordinance? It prohibited slavery in that territory, the territory from which all future states that they could foresee were going to come from. It prohibited slavery in those territories. And it did have a fugitive slave clause, but the fugitive slave clause protected runaways from the existing states that had it, one of the original states, meaning it anticipated the only states that would continue to have slavery would be one of the existing states that had it. No new states were going to have slavery in this country. And here's the last fact I'll close on. What was the vote in Congress on that? Well, there was one dissenting vote from a guy from New York, and some commentary about that vote by one of his colleagues was he didn't understand that issue any more than he understood any other issue that he was ever voting on. He was the only dissenting vote. Every delegate from the southern states, from the southern slave states, voted in favor of prohibiting slavery in the Northwest Territories, that vast territory of the Northwest Territories. That tells you what the momentum was towards freedom in this country, towards freedom and justice and liberty for all peoples, including those people who were brought here in bondage. That is our history, that is our legacy, that is the narrative that we should be restoring and that we should be focusing on. But sadly, most academics don't know this story, and it's certainly true that nowadays most Americans don't know this story. And I have to say, I didn't know this story until about the last 15 or 20 years that I became interested in anti-slavery constitutionalism. And with that, I look forward to hearing what the other commentators, what our other distinguished scholars have to say about this subject. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Randy. Justin?
Okay, thanks very much to the American Enterprise Institute and to Yuval and Adam for extending me this invitation. I'm delighted to participate in this important event. When Adam and Yuval invited me to participate, I immediately knew that I wanted to write about Frederick Douglass and one of his famous speeches called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And so I'm going to read from some of what I've put together today. The title of my paper is The Founding of Frederick Douglass. Leave it up to you to determine whether there's a double entendre there. Okay, so on July 5th, 1852, in Rochester, New York, as Frederick Douglass strode to the lectern at the august Corinthian Hall to deliver an Independence Day speech, he fought a significant bout of anxiety. Douglass was not, of course, a man who grew nervous lightly. Even at the tender age of 34, he had already become a prominent abolitionist, an acclaimed author, and a revered orator. Indeed, Douglass rose to fame in no small part due to his ability to exhibit uncommon mettle. Before he entered public life, Douglass not only withstood severe ritualized beatings at the hands of an infamous slave breaker, he also dared to emancipate himself by escaping slavery. Sometimes in his time as an abolitionist, his message was an unpopular one. And he was beaten up, including in Pendleton, Indiana in 1843, where he was beaten by a mob so savagely that he lost consciousness and broke his right hand. Such prior brushes with danger did not, however, prevent him from experiencing the jitters in Rochester on that July afternoon as he listened to the Reverend Robert Raymond perform an introductory reading of the Declaration of Independence and prepared to deliver his address. Following the Declaration's recitation, observers noted that Douglass's hands trembled as he gripped his prepared remarks. And Douglass opened those remarks by confessing to the assembled masses that he was experiencing a quailing sensation, he called it. He was afraid. Douglass need not have been worried. When he concluded the speech now known as What to the Slave is the 4th of July, the audience responded rapturously, leaping to its feet to confer what one person called a universal burst of applause. Today, the initial ovation has not yet fully subsided. If anything, the applause has only grown louder. What to the Slave is the 4th of July long ago became required reading in curricula throughout the nation. Distinguished scholars have bathed the address in a sea of superlatives. Professor Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School has called it, this is a quote, the most damning critique of American hypocrisy ever uttered. David Blight, author of the monumental Douglass biography, said that it is one of the, this is a quote, one of the great speeches in American history. He said, the speech transcended his audience as well as Corinthian Hall to enter the realm inhabited by great art. It's not hard to understand why Douglass's speech has won such fervent admiration. The speech is rhetorically and emotionally powerful, advancing pungent criticism of how the United States has too often failed to honor its lofty ideals. It is hard to imagine a more eloquent spokesman for this proposition than the mighty Frederick Douglass. And surely some of the admiration for the speech is attributable to Douglass's remarkable life. And he is a fascinating figure, and although he was divisive in his own 19th century, it seems to me that he has improbably achieved something like universal acclaim in the 21st century. Maybe it's not a terrible surprise that lots of Democrats claim the legacy of Frederick Douglass, including former President Obama, but the Republican Party has also claimed Frederick Douglass. Indeed, there was a ceremony unveiling a statue of Frederick Douglass in 2013, and many members of the GOP's congressional delegation wore large buttons proclaiming Frederick Douglass was a Republican. This same dynamic is found at the judiciary. Justice Thomas claims Frederick Douglass, and that rightly understood, Frederick Douglass would abhor affirmative action. And Justice Jackson and Justice Sotomayor in the recent SFFA versus Harvard decision also claim Frederick Douglass. So he has something like a universally high approval rating. Given Douglas's widespread appeal today, it is with considerable trepidation, indeed a quailing sensation, that I now venture criticism of Douglas's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." To avoid misunderstanding, let me be clear at the outset that I too worship at the altar of St. Frederick. His astonishing life, which traversed the path not just from slavery to freedom, but to the very apex of American intellectual life, deserves the honored place that it has attained. His writing and thinking profoundly improved both our nation and the world. His example also vitally improved my own life, as I grew up right here in Washington, D.C., southeast D.C., east of the Anacostia River, a stone's throw from the great Frederick's estate. That's what black people at the time called Frederick Douglass, the Great Frederick. And I was keenly aware that just down the road from my house, a person who began life enslaved somehow managed to rise and become one of the significant figures of American letters. And I still recall today that when I read the revealingly titled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, the book captured my attention, haunted, and mesmerized me in a way that no other book had to date. So I hold him in such high regard today that when I'm teaching Frederick Douglass's writings today that Professor Barnett gestured toward, if I understand correctly, I sometimes will pointedly refer to him as Justice Douglas rather than Frederick Douglass. He's the only person not to have sat on the Supreme Court of the United States that I confer that honorific upon. So I really do hold Frederick Douglass in high esteem. Nevertheless, no person, not even the great Frederick, stands above criticism. Some esteemed theorists have invoked Douglass for the proposition that the 4th of July and black people go together like oil and water. For example, Professor Charles Mills, a noted philosopher, has written the following, I'm quoting, "Douglass saw correctly that the 4th of July belonged to white Americans rather than to all Americans, and his anger at this appropriation continues to resound with us." But what I'm going to try to suggest today is that these racialized understandings of who can legitimately lay claim to the 4th of July are unduly constrained. The 4th of July gave birth, of course, to the Declaration of Independence, and that document sparked not only the American Revolution against Britain. The Declaration's high-minded language has inspired many other revolts against oppression, including against white supremacy within the United States. Douglass's famous Rochester oration would have been considerably improved, I argue, had he lavished much greater attention on the Declaration of Independence's liberatory text and its larger meaning. So, what I really want to say is that in trying to recover several notable instances where black people have laid claim to the Declaration's emancipatory text, I hope not only to honor their efforts, but to insist further that the 4th of July is mine and ours. Okay, so I'll just briefly describe his famous oration, the Declaration of Independence, what to the slave. It is largely, condemnatory. He speaks overwhelmingly in the second person, referring to his audience as this is, in effect, your 4th of July, not mine, he says. You may rejoice, I must mourn. And of course, the most famous passage opens, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. This goes on in that vein for some time. It seems to me that this searing denunciation of the United States informs a significant tradition within black political thought. Reading these words today, it is striking how Douglass's remarks anticipate acerbic criticisms leveled by Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and more recently, Reverend Jeremiah Wright in his sermon that proclaimed not God bless America, but God damn America. Some people have suggested that if you really pay attention to Douglas's speech, that there are elements of more overt patriotism. I'm not convinced about that. I think that the overwhelming thrust of the speech is condemnatory rather than celebratory. Jack Balkin of Yale and Sandy Levinson of Texas have said the following. This is how they understand that speech. One of Douglas's most famous speeches on the 4th of July emphasized that the Declaration of Independence was only a declaration for white people, right? That's pretty cut and dry. Yet, I think that when Douglas said, "What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence?" he asks rhetorically, I think that the right, powerful response should have been everything. Such a response would have proceeded to pay careful attention to the Declaration's text. Indeed, 8 years after he spoke in Rochester, Douglas himself creatively and masterfully demonstrated how Black Americans could construe a different foundational American text, the U.S. Constitution, as a document that promotes racial equality and slavery's abolition. So in Glasgow in 1860, Douglas delivers another famous address, one that has now, it's becoming canonical, if not quite canonical. It appears in many US constitutional law casebooks. And the name of the address is the Constitution of the United States. Is it pro-slavery or is it anti-slavery? And he argues, properly understood, the Constitution of the United States is anti-slavery. And he does this by paying very careful attention to constitutional text. And he pulls apart textual considerations from one version, now in disrepute, of originalism. Original intent originalism rather than original public meaning originalism. And so he seizes upon the diffidence about slavery in the Constitution to say, properly understood, it needs to be anti-slavery. He says, "We the people." Its language is "we the people," not "we the white people," not even "we the citizens," nor "we the privileged class," nor "we the high," nor "we the low," but "we the people." And if Negroes are people, they are included in the benefits for which the Constitution of America was ordained and established. And he goes on in this vein with I'll give you just one example from the speech. He talks about the 3/5 clause, talking about who's going to receive representation in the House of Representatives and determining population. 3/5 of slaves are going to count toward representation. And he says, well, when you really think about it, that is an anti-slavery provision, because if there were not slavery, the amount of representation would increase. And so properly understood, we should think of this as a disability on the slaveholding states. And he goes on in that vein in some ways. And so I think had Douglas employed similar techniques regarding the Declaration of Independence, as he did with respect to the Constitution, that it would have been apparent that you can see the Declaration as a liberatory text. And recall that just before Douglas spoke, the text of the Constitution was spoken aloud and delivered. And so let me tell you a couple of examples of how Douglas could have laid claim to the Declaration of Independence as a liberatory tool. He could have said, with the beginning, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and noted that just as the Constitution's preamble is non-racial, so too with respect to the Declaration. You could imagine Douglas saying, the Declaration does not instruct that all white men are created equal, but instead embraced a vision of racial egalitarianism that did not acknowledge racial boundaries. Similarly, with respect to the God-given inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you could argue quite powerfully that bondage quite literally prohibits slaves from realizing either their liberty or the ability to pursue happiness. Slavery's heavy chains render it impossible for those in its confines to move about the nation freely in pursuit of joy or anything else for that matter. You could also step back and extract larger principles from the Declaration of Independence. That its dominant through lines sound in anti-despotic and anti-tyrannical motivations. Yes, of course, the primary tyrant in mind was King George III, but you can also understand it as rebuking the many despots and the many tyrants who ruled American plantations. There's lots of language along these lines. I won't go into the details here, but one can make a powerful argument that even some of the grievances that are leveled at King George III would apply with great force against slaveholders. Had Douglas laid extensive claim to the Declaration's liberatory promise in Corinthian Hall long ago, that act would hardly have been a foreign development in Black American political thought. Instead, Black people extolling the Declaration of Independence and its ideals is, with apologies to H. Rap Brown, as American as cherry pie. I'm going to close here with just offering a couple of examples of celebrated Black Americans who have laid claim to the Declaration of Independence, citing it as a vital source of inspiration in the struggle for racial equality and beyond. It's a really remarkable book published in 1944. It's called What the Negro Wants, and it's a collection of essays by eminent Black Americans. And several of those essays invoke the Declaration of Independence in the struggle for racial equality, including an essay by Mary McLeod Bethune, founder of the National Council of Negro Women. She titles her essay, Certain Unalienable Rights. And she opens with a long allusion to the Boston Tea Party and says that Black people who are disappointed with the country today are working in that honorable tradition. And she mentions the Declaration of Independence. Roy Wilkins makes another contribution to that essay. And he makes similar moves there where he says that the Negro is thoroughly American. He thinks and lives in the American tradition. He learns from American textbooks about the Revolutionary War, about independence, the spirit of America, and equality. And that was not a one-off for Wilkins. In 1955, he talked about those who were defending Jim Crow, and he says that the defenders of Jim Crow say never, like the Romans before the coming of Christ, like King John before Magna Carta, like George III of England before the Declaration of Independence. Martin Luther King Jr., obviously most famously in 1963, in the I Have a Dream speech, identifies the Declaration as a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. He quotes from the Declaration of Independence repeatedly, including in the most famous passage. It does seem to me that this is one of these instances where familiarity breeds not contempt, but it does breed inattention. And people don't pay attention to the way that King was invoking the Declaration as much as they should. And of course, during the classical phase of the civil rights movement, King was far from alone in portraying its mission not as a castigation of American ideals, but instead as a consecration of those ideals. It may be tempting to believe that these sorts of invocations of the Declaration of Independence were only available to 20th century and 21st century Black folks. It's not the case. Danielle Allen of Harvard, who participated in a prior event and has noted that there's a man called Prince Hall, who only months after the Declaration of Independence became public, said that properly understood, Prince Hall was a freed Black man, and he said in Massachusetts that properly understood, it requires the abolition of slavery. Professor Allen says that this is the first usage of the Declaration of Independence to say that it's beyond anything involving King George III and Britain. Even Douglas himself in 1862 delivered another far less known 4th of July address Professor Blight's biography goes to town on this, as he should. Delivers it in a place called Himrod Corners. And there he says he's not talking about your fathers, but he's talking, Douglas does, about our fathers. He says, seldom in the history of American letters has the subtraction, pardon me, he says, your fathers, not our fathers. Okay. So it seems to me that instead of excoriating white Americans for failing to honor fully the Declaration's promise of liberty, here Douglas encouraged them to make the promise real. And the last thing I'll say is, now, several decades after Douglas made his pivotal turn, theorists in certain corners doubt the wisdom of embracing America's governmental and intellectual foundations. While the Douglas posture of 1852, the Rochester speech, may be deeply fashionable today, we should not lose sight of the fact that the Douglas approach of 1862 is for the ages. Indeed, if Frederick Douglass and Mary McLeod Bethune and Roy Wilkins and Martin Luther King and Prince Hall all found inspiration in the Declaration of Independence as they waged their battles for racial equality, who are we now to abandon that honorable tradition? Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Kurt?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My thanks to the American Enterprise Institute for putting together this conference and for the honor of inviting me to be a part of this remarkable panel. It's wonderful to hear my colleagues talk about the Northwest Ordinance, thank you very much, which I just, a couple of weeks ago, my students were studying in my seminar on the Reconstruction Amendments, and about Frederick Douglass, who my students studied this week, including his Glasgow speech, where he delivered to escape possible arrest for having been accused of participating in John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. All of these documents are documents we should know. All of these documents are documents that hopefully are going to be part of the next generation of teaching. I'd like to start by quoting a couple of passages from the Declaration. Two passages that I think have played an enormous role in advancing American freedom. One you know about, and one you might have forgotten about. All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That comes from the beginning. This sentence comes towards the end. These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The Declaration contains these two key principles of American liberty: individual freedom and structural federalism. First, every person has an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Second, the American people have the right to enjoy these liberties in a union comprised of free and independent states. And although we often remember and rightly celebrate the first principle of freedom, we also should appreciate how the second principle of federalism has advanced the first. The abolition of chattel slavery, for example, came about as a result of successful mobilization in the free and independent states, a mobilization that would have been thwarted and crushed absent the structural protection of constitutional federalism. So for just a couple of minutes, I'd like to briefly tell the story about how independence gave birth to federalism and how federalism facilitated a new birth of freedom that culminated with the adoption of the 13th and 14th Amendments. Again, historical narratives often associate states' rights with the pro-slavery South. In fact, Madisonian federalism provided a constitutional shelter under which the Declaration's principles of freedom and equality could take political root in the antebellum northern states, and again, eventually become part of our fundamental law. Now, as Randy has already reminded us, prior to the Declaration of Independence, chattel slavery existed throughout the North American continent. Slavery was endemic among the indigenous peoples of the interior. It was routinely practiced by the Spanish in the Southwest, and it was official British policy in all of the Atlantic colonies. Following their declared separation from Britain, several northern states immediately began dismantling local laws permitting slavery. Again, as Randy's pointed out, the people of Vermont adopted a constitution declaring that all men are born equally free and independent. You had Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Connecticut passing acts calling for the gradual abolition of slavery. And by 1787, again, 5 of these states, or Vermont, a state to be, right, had officially moved against slavery. And in 1787, yes, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which declared, quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted." Originally drafted by Thomas Jefferson, this clause effectively guaranteed that any state carved out of the Northwest would enter the Union as a free state. That same year, the Philadelphia Convention drafted a new constitution. The original articles had failed to sufficiently provide for the common defense and secure the blessings of liberty. The new constitution would advance those goals and do so by way of a more robust central government, but also do so in a manner that preserved the basic structure of American federalism. As Publius wrote in Federalist 45, the powers of the national government would be few and defined, while those left to the states would be numerous and indefinite. Now, the liberty-enhancing idea of separating power at the national level is well known. This is the Madisonian ideal of checks and balances. Less appreciated is the related Madisonian idea that liberty is also enhanced by separating the powers of national and local governments. Maintaining these separate spheres of authority ensured an ongoing competition for the affection of the people. As Madison wrote in The Federalist, should the national government attempt to escape its constitutional limits, the state stood ready to, quote, "sound the alarm to the people," end quote, and mobilize state-level resistance. And in fact, in one of the first serious constitutional disputes in our nation's history, it involved an overreach by the national government and one which prompted just such a Madisonian alarm. In 1798, the federal government passed the Sedition Act. It criminalized speech falsely impugning the acts or character of the national government. This was our first misinformation law. In response, Madison and Jefferson sounded the alarm, and they drafted resolutions to be delivered in the Virginia and Kentucky state assemblies. And according to Madison, in his famous report on the Virginia resolutions, Congress had, in fact, exceeded its constitutional powers, and it had intruded into matters meant to be left to the states. Madison's argument won the day, if not in the courts of law, then in the court of public opinion. In the national elections of 1800, the political party responsible for the Sedition Act suffered a landslide defeat, and they were replaced by a new political party of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans. And as a result, the country entered the first millennia of its existence broadly committed to the constitutional principles of Madisonian federalism. And the survival of that federalism in 1800 then became incredibly important as the nation came apart over the issue of slavery. Early state efforts to abolish or restrict the expansion of slavery were wholly dependent on structural federalism. Absent those protections, the early antebellum abolitionist movement would have been suffocated under a blanket of pro-slavery nationalism. Between the founding and the Civil War, pro-slavery interests dominated the national government. As we've been reminded, as Justin reminded us, the 3/5 clause of the original Constitution gave a representational bonus to the slaveholding states. This increased the political power of the slaveholding states in Congress and in the Electoral College. The result was an almost unbroken line of slave-owning antebellum presidents and a series of federal actions supporting slavery and suppressing abolitionism. In addition to the 1793 and 1850 Fugitive Slave Acts, the national government also passed the gag rules, prohibiting the receipt of abolitionist petitions. And federal officials purged the national mail of abolitionist literature. In Dred Scott, the national Supreme Court ruled that the Missouri Compromise was an unconstitutional attempt to limit the advance of slavery. In short, without federalism providing a safe haven for pro-freedom mobilization in the northern states, a pro-slavery national government would have crushed local abolitionist dissent and established slavery as national policy. Instead, abolitionism in the northern states diversified and expanded, and gave us heroes like Frederick Douglass and allowed Frederick Douglass to change his mind about the Constitution over time. What began as state-level activism by the 1850s had evolved into a national party, one devoted to keeping slavery contained in the southern states. The Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln expressly celebrated structural federalism while simultaneously opposing the extension of slavery into the national territories. Having failed to force northern states to accept slavery as national policy, the so-called Confederate States of America now insisted on a unilateral right to secede from the Union, an equal, if opposite, violation of Madisonian federalism. When secessionists moved on federal armories and South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, civil war became inevitable. But a war to end the rebellion is not necessarily a war to end slavery. Neither Lincoln nor congressional Republicans were willing to wait for an end of the Civil War before pursuing the adoption of an abolition amendment. Republicans drafted the 13th Amendment in early 1864 and secured its passage in January 1865, months before Lee's surrender at Appomattox. And for their text, Republicans drew from the well of the nation's founding, and they used Thomas Jefferson's language prohibiting slavery in the Northwest Territory. And so, we have Thomas Jefferson to thank for three of the most celebrated freedom texts in American history: the Declaration of Independence, Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance, and the 13th Amendment. Although the 13th abolished the formal institutions, the malignant spirit of slavery still roamed the land in the form of Southern black codes, laws that denied the equal protection of every person's life, liberty, and property. So Republicans proposed a 14th Amendment. And this new amendment would further entrench the principles of the Declaration into American law. For if all men were created equal, then every person has an equal right to the protection of their life, liberty, and property. I'd like to close by simply pointing out that when they adopted these amendments, they did so not by forcing them on the southern states, but on insisting that every state in the Union have an opportunity to ratify those amendments and do so on a state-by-state basis. And as I love to remind my students, one of the greatest moments in our constitutional history occurred on July 9th, 1868, when the newly elected majority black legislature of South Carolina voted to ratify the 14th Amendment. In that moment, the Declaration of Independence took on flesh and blood and walked among us. And that miracle was made possible by the generative interaction of both freedom and federalism, both enshrined in the Declaration and both now entrenched in fundamental law. So, here's to the last 250 years of federalism and freedom. God grant us the wisdom to preserve them for the next 250. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kurt, Justin, Randy. We're going to have time later in this section of the day for audience questions. And before that, I'll have a couple questions of my own. But before that, I just wanted to turn to our speakers and say a lot's already been said. Anybody has anything they'd immediately like to respond to or build upon, we have some time. Randy?
Well, I would just say that I'm really glad I got to speak first, because my co-panelists were going to say a lot of the things that I was saying, and then I wouldn't have anything to say. So I really appreciate that. I agree 100%. I'm not used to agreeing 100% with Kurt, but I do in this case think that the emphasis on federalism, which I actually deal with in my article by a single line by saying, I can't get into that. I'm glad there's going to be another article in the collection that does get into that. I think that's very important. Also, my contribution closes with Douglas's Glasgow speech, and why it was that Douglas, how he interpreted the Constitution as anti-slavery. I actually think in my article that even though the Constitution was not pro-slavery, I also don't think it was anti-slavery. And the question is, what is to blame? And in that speech, Douglas made a very important point, and this was a point that I closed my article on, and that is that we have to separate the Constitution of the United States from the government of the United States. It's the Constitution of the United States that I believe was neither pro-slavery nor anti-slavery, allowing for the generation of the principle articulated by Salmon Chase and Charles Sumner, and that is the constitutionality established the regime of freedom national and slavery local. So that's true, he said. But the government of the United States was who was responsible for the fact that we had a pro-slavery federal government. And the pro-slavery federal government was in many respects, and this is what Kurt said as well, as a result of the 3/5 bonus of representation that the slave states got, which gave them another bonus in the Electoral College, which gave them a series of pro-slavery, or at the very minimum, neutral towards slavery presidents who appointed pro-slavery, or at the very worst, neutral towards slavery Supreme Court. And as a result, the result of all of this is what the anti-slavery folks and Frederick Douglass referred to as the slave power. And that's exactly the reason why Kurt is correct, that if given the domination of the slave power at the national level, that is what we would have been governed under, but for federalism. However, federalism did allow for pushback against the slave power, and the final proof that the Constitution was not pro-slavery is that once the slave power was defeated politically and the Republican Party was on its way into power, the slave power states had to leave the Union because they knew that what was coming was an anti-slavery program put in place by an anti-slavery party called the Republican Party that was going to undermine their peculiar institution. And that's why they had to get while the getting was good. And that is testimony to the original meaning of the text of the Constitution as opposed to how it came to be interpreted afterwards.
Thanks, Randy. Any other initial reactions or thoughts? Justin?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, thank you for those comments. Douglass is a protean figure. Professor Kennedy wrote a remarkable review essay suggesting about David Blight's biography, suggesting that Douglass, one of the reasons that so many different people claim him is that he articulates different positions over time. His constitutional vision begins as a Garrisonian one, that is to say, in effect, more or less, God damn the Constitution, right? I want to see it destroyed. And then over time, he moves almost 180 degrees and says, in fact, God bless the Constitution. And if you look at it hard enough and really foreground the text, it is a wonderfully sort of creative argument, right? And there is I believe, transgressive power to saying that's not a document that sort of excludes me or throws me out, but instead I am there. And by pledging allegiance to the Constitution and eventually pledging allegiance to the Declaration of Independence, as he would in the Himrod Corners speech that just about nobody knows about, there is, as I say, a real opportunity for liberation, and many of Frederick Douglass's errors in the project of racial egalitarianism have followed his second lead. It does say something notable about our current moment, that the 1852 Rochester speech is the one that is sort of universally known. Indeed, my daughter came here from Connecticut on a school trip and purchased from a museum a copy of this address that is rolled up on sort of parchment paper. It is quite prevalent. It makes the rounds on Twitter every 4th of July. And I wish that more people appreciated that Frederick Douglass did have different sort of positions and attitudes toward the United States that he articulated at different points in his life.
Just briefly, and thank you for that, and thank you for raising the importance of Douglass. When I put together my collection of documents, they're meant to be documents that relate to the framing and ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And of course, the whole beginning of it has to do with the constitutional debates that preceded Reconstruction and the adoption of the 13th and 14th. And so that's where Frederick Douglass was going to come in. And I did an edited version of his narrative of my life as a slave, and I had to exclude it. It broke my heart. But now I had to make a choice between the 4th of July speech or the Glasgow speech. And I decided to go with the Glasgow speech. Do we have a pro-slavery constitution? No, is his answer. I went with that one because that one seemed to have the greater impact in his time, as in it showing an important strain of a new understanding of the Constitution that could be pro-freedom. So that's the one that I went with.
Just a couple of questions from me. Throughout your opening remarks, you touched time and time again on the ways in which the American legislature was very adept at legislating broad statements in favor of liberty and equality, either in the shadow of slavery or in the aftermath of slavery. You mentioned them all: the Declaration of Independence, the Northwest Ordinance, the Reconstruction Amendments, and eventually the Civil Rights Act. But in actually implementing those laws, either in the courts or in administration, our history has been troubled, we'll say, over and over again, or contested, or controversial. And I'm just wondering, what does this teach us, either about the principles or about those institutions? Why is it that Congress, even before we had a Constitution, our Congress could rise to the moment and legislate these statements, but then in actually implementing them, it becomes so difficult? Randy?
Well, 2 data points. Number one, the Constitution the Commerce Power gave Congress the power to abolish the international slave trade, but it delayed the implementation of that till 1808. The minute they could do it, they did it. They abolished it. Thomas Jefferson proposed legislation. He signed that legislation. They didn't hesitate. And in fact, prior to that, something that I didn't realize until I read Sean Walentz's book, they were already using their commerce power to regulate slavery by barring, for example, American ships to participate in the slave trade. So Congress did step up to the plate there. However, second data point, Congress in 1875 passes the Civil Rights, I shouldn't say however, I would say second data point.
Right.
In 1875, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1875, in tribute to Charles Sumner, who had been championing this for 4 years and who has passed away. And that barred racial discrimination in the provision of public accommodations, the very thing that later on Congress would do in the 1960s using its commerce power. Here, Congress does it using its Section 5 power under the 14th Amendment. Congress stepped up to the plate. Had that amendment been allowed to work and be enforced by the Justice Department, which was created to enforce amendments and provisions like that, our history would have been completely different. Yeah. But what happened to that amendment? It was invalidated by the Supreme Court in a way that was wholly unjustified, and just really turned the 14th Amendment from bread into stone.
But I guess what's the upshot of that then for the other branches? You're alluding to what the court did and did wrong in that case. And the court, time and time again, fell short of the sort of the call for equality and liberty that we saw coming out of the legislatures. Administration also has been extremely difficult to this on these questions. What does that teach us about either the courts or administration, or just the challenges of bringing these sort of broad principles into day-to-day reality?
I'll leave it to my colleagues to say more. I'm just going to say all of these political institutions are creatures of their time, and they're creatures of the politics of their time. Yeah. And that is certainly what happened to the 14th Amendment after it was adopted. Politics shifted, and some of the people who had been put on the Supreme Court were there for other reasons other than commitments to this idea of racial equality, and eventually they had their way. So I would just say politics gets in the way of a lot of good things.
Kurt, Justin?
It might be, I mean, just briefly, there's a lot to that. And I agree with what Randy has said. But part of the constitutional psychology that goes on is this idea that most days we as private citizens are concerned with our private lives and not necessarily with the larger considerations of justice for those around us. It's only during certain great and extraordinary moments that we come together as a people and we actually focus on issues of such fundamental importance that we'd actually write them into the Constitution. Then what happens, and we've done that at the time of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, then it is left to ordinary politics afterwards to keep the attention on what it is that the people wanted to do. And we've seen an unfortunate history of the moment just shifting away, politics shifting away. I guess the silver lining, though, is that those moments remain entrenched and written into the document, waiting for a later political climate to take advantage of what the people in the past have done.
I agree with what my colleagues have said. High ideals are a really important thing. When you articulate high ideals for yourself or for your country, it leaves you open and vulnerable to the charge of hypocrisy. But what's the alternative? To articulate incredibly low ideals and say, we're not going to really try to do anything. It seems to me that you want to set your sights here, and even if it's not honored immediately, that over time people can return to those lofty ideals and say, we're not being true to the ideals that we articulated and our forefathers and foremothers articulated many moons ago. There are those who think that the focus on constitutional text is, mistaken, and that the Reconstruction amendments were in effect just way too ahead of their time in order to be honored. And so, the civil rights cases served to nullify the public accommodations measure that was enacted in the aftermath of the ratification of the 14th Amendment, and exactly as Professor Barnett suggested a moment ago, it takes 8 decades or so in order to right that wrong. So nevertheless, if the choice is between high ideals or low ideals, give me high ideals every day of the week.
Maybe one more question from me. And this came to mind, especially during Kurt's remarks. Just the reminder that the Reconstruction Amendments didn't just end slavery and once again announce equality and liberty, but then finally gave the right to vote to Black men. What does that tell us about democracy? I mean, in many ways, that was the most controversial immediate aftermath of the Reconstruction Amendments, the fact that in Louisiana, South Carolina, and elsewhere, you'd have Black people voting and holding political power, especially in our legislatures. What can we learn about democracy from the importance of that amendment and also from the political backlash that it stirred up?
Well, there's a wonderful story there. And of course, one of the most dramatic moments in our history involves the extension of political power and voting power to Black Americans. The 15th Amendment, of course, removes the color bar from voting. What was controversial about the 15th Amendment wasn't the extension of voting to Black Americans in the South. Black Americans in the South already had the right to vote. Under the Reconstruction Acts, which were passed as part of the effort to ratify the 14th Amendment, you had Black Americans in the South registered to vote alongside of loyal Americans in the South to decide whether or not they wanted new state governments, and then have those new state governments decide whether or not they wanted a new amendment. So Black Americans then voted for new state governments, and they voted in favor of the 14th Amendment. They then were able to recognize the Republicans were able to recognize the political power, the democratic power of Black Americans in the South, and they began to consider maybe we need an amendment that would bring the vote to the North. And suddenly, there was dramatic resistance against bringing the vote to Black Americans in the North from people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wanted white women to have the right to vote prior to Black American males. So that the struggle over the vote and the struggle to bring democratic power and democratic legitimacy, both North and South, I think is one of the great, generally unknown stories of American history. But the power of that democratic moment gives a legitimacy to the Reconstruction Amendments that I think are not fully appreciated. These were not forced on the people of the South. They were democratically embraced.
Yeah. Any other thoughts before we open it up? Just want to say we normally have questions coming in from online, but I'm embarrassed to say I left the tablet and my phone back at the back of the podium. So if we have any questions come in, I'll need Nicole or Tori to announce the questions for me. And I'm going to give the first question to Yuval. Yuval, the microphone's going to find you.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I know the line. Thank you. Thank you, really, for Wonderful presentations and conversation. I think this is a question mostly for Kurt. I'm really struck by the way you lay out the narrative of federalism in the story of the advancement of racial equality. How do you think about it after the 14th Amendment? The general story is the 14th Amendment limited federalism. It nationalized the preservation of individual rights. It constrains what the states can do. It says no state shall, which is a phrase they'd avoided at the convention in various ways. And in the wake of the 14th Amendment, it seems as though federalism is narrower than it was before. Is that a vindication of what had been achieved by, in a sense, by federalism in the abolition movement, or is it a betrayal of the logic of the original Constitution?
It's a great question, right? You have the role of the states and state-level agitation in favor of the good guys, okay, prior to the 14th Amendment. But then after, you have this long, sad history of resistance in the states and ultimately to Jim Crow in the South after the 14th Amendment. I guess one approach to that question would be to remember that federalism is a two-edged sword. That is, it is meant to create this dynamic tension and this dynamic competition between the states and the federal government. And each one can hold the other accountable. In the first episode of our nation's history, it was states holding the federal government accountable to what they thought was the true vision of the founding and the Declaration of Independence. After the 14th Amendment and newly empowered federal courts and expanded federal courts who are now able to enforce these new amendments, it was now a new understanding of the American people writ large who were going to hold the states accountable to the last speaking of the people with those amendments. So I think you would expect over time, if Madison's correct, you would expect over time for federalism to ebb and flow between the national and the local. And of course, I think even in terms of contemporary politics, we can see a shift between competition between the national government and potentially resistance by the states.
Anybody else on this? Go ahead, Randy.
There was too much state power in the beginning. I mean, how much state power was there? Enough power to authorize, states had enough power to authorize the ownership of some people by other people. That's too much power. But that was what was necessary in order to form the Union in the first place. With the 14th Amendment, you created a federal check, a check based on the individual rights of all the people of the states, a check that did not previously exist. The rights previously existed, but the enforcement mechanism did not previously exist. What we lack now, we've kind of gone too far in the other direction. Now what we could use is some additional state checks on federal power. Part of that was given up when the state legislatures ceased to appoint senators, which gave them one half of the Congress that could be various states representative. We've lost that. I proposed a constitutional amendment that actually got introduced into both houses of Congress called the Repeal Amendment, which would have given a supermajority of states the power to, state legislatures, the power to repeal any federal law or regulation. It got so far as to be introduced into both houses of Congress, but we lacked enough dark money to actually put it across to the American people. We needed a little more dark money for that purpose, but so it failed. But I think we could use a few more checks on the federal government that come out of the states.
Let me ask a follow-up on this. Another thing that occurred to me, I'll just preface with this. A few years ago, we did a book here at AEI for the 200th anniversary of McCulloch versus Maryland. And I wrote an essay, among many others, for that book. And in going back to the debates leading up to McCulloch versus Maryland and the actual litigation of the case, one of the recurring themes is the extent to which the North and advocates for national power really wanted to push the argument that the strong national power was needed to limit slavery. And Chief Justice Marshall avoids that at all costs in his actual decision. He could see the implications, obviously, for slavery, but did not allude to it in the argument, in his opinion. And my takeaway from that, in reflecting on the arguments he did make, was McCulloch versus Maryland was still one of the most important Supreme Court decisions for eventually ending slavery. McCulloch versus Maryland made it possible for the North to generate enormous economic power, eventually enormous military power, and those sources of national power ultimately were brought to bear in the Civil War and made the Civil War winnable for the North. And so in listening to your remarks, Kurt, on the importance of federalism to create space for abolitionism to grow in the antebellum era, I wonder, isn't it a good thing that in fact we did have this source of national authority and national economic power that ended up overcoming the power of the southern states and making the promises of the Declaration of Independence, making them achievable in the aftermath of the Civil War?
Well, that's a great point. That's a great point. And
Great. This has been a nice panel, and we'll end it right there.
Right. It kind of shows the contingency of history, right? I mean, the growth of national power. At the end of the day, did it help slavery or hurt slavery? I think I would want to know exactly more about how that would play out. I don't see anything about machinery and grand machinery that prevents it from being used to grind down a human soul. Sure. I think we learned that, of course, from the invention of the cotton gin. I think just for the moment, I would hold on to the importance of federalism as developing an anti-slavery ideology that would use the machinery of technology for good, and that absent that federalism protective growth, the machinery of the North might have been used as something very damning.
And Justin, I feel like I have to pull you into this part of the conversation. Given your book on education and the Supreme Court and equality, how do you think about these federalism questions that we're sort of drawing out in the conversation?
Yeah, it's a very interesting set of discussions. In some of the Supreme Court's first decisions getting involved with schools, there's an idea that judges ought not go here. That the Supreme Court of the United States has no business turning in what was referred to as a school board for the country. This was an argument that was made even in the flag salute cases from the 1940s. I have in mind the Barnett case, where a West Virginia statute is requiring everyone to pledge allegiance to the flag. That raises an issue if you're a Jehovah's Witness or wish not to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And many people at the time thought, well, this is just a quintessentially local matter, and if we have any respect for federalism and local control, we need to be able to stay out of this business. That's not how the Supreme Court decided it, and of course, similar arguments were made with respect to Brown versus Board of Education. The Southern Manifesto in 1956 comes out 2 years after Brown, from 1954, and one of the arguments that was made in this document that was signed by about 100 congressmen and senators, saying that in effect Brown was wrongly decided, is that if you look for the word education in the Constitution of the United States, it's not there, right? If you sort of Control F for the word education, you won't see it there. Therefore, the federal government in the form of the courts should stay out of this altogether. Now, those arguments did not carry the day, but you do see these ideas, of course, and these issues do continue to reverberate, including at the court today. The court later this term is going to hear arguments about whether parents can opt out of particular educational training for their children. And so these arguments continue to occur and recur in various guises throughout time.
Randy?
Just one little thing I forgot to mention in response to Yuval's question, and that is, it was these certain justices' commitment to the pre-Civil War concept of federalism that led them to gut the 14th Amendment. So that commitment to that unlimited power and the fear of the national government that caused them to gut a constitutionally adopted amendment. It's in the text of the Constitution. That was not the appropriate thing they should have done, but that's how powerful that vision of federalism was.
Great. I see Nicole in the back with, I think, an audience question from online.
I'll summarize a little bit. So they're curious about the relationship between the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship and why that's such a central piece of that amendment.
Just.
Well, the traditional understanding would be that the 14th Amendment arises partly in response to the woeful Dred Scott decision from 1857, where Chief Justice Taney says black people are not citizens of the United States and cannot be forevermore, regardless of whether They're free or enslaved. And the 14th Amendment in the first sentence says that everyone born in the United States is a citizen. That's a paraphrase, obviously. And this gives us the idea of birthright citizenship. And that is a very rare constitutional amendment that is understood to repudiate a Supreme Court decision. So obviously, these issues are very much in the air right now about the exact contours of birthright citizenship, but that's the basic idea, and that's what is the nub of the issue.
Before Kurt and Randy jump in on this, I want to expand.
I'm doing no jumping.
No, I know. Well, let me just expand the question a little bit. We're in the middle of a national debate suddenly about birthright citizenship. Of course, this debate's been sort of emerging over the last couple of decades, but now it's front and center thanks to the executive order. There may be litigation about this, a Supreme Court case someday. There's going to be scholarship and op-eds and essays and all of that. I guess my softer way of asking the question would be, what can we learn from our history of debating equality and liberty, sort of the best moments and the worst moments of American history, and grappling with the nature of citizenship, equality, and liberty? What can we learn from those debates as we go about thinking about this question in our own time?
No, that's too soft. I want to go for the hard
Okay,
question
sure.
right away. There's much to be learned from our history before we ever get to, that we should start with before we get to the particular question on the plate before us today in terms of the executive order having to do with birthright citizenship. One of the, I think, surprising aspects of our history, I'm curious what my co-panelists think about this, is that the 14th Amendment begins, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And it was the first time we defined how you became a citizen of the United States. Our first 70 years as a Constitution, it wasn't defined. There were references to citizenship in the Constitution, natural born citizen for president, things along those lines. But how you became a citizen was pretty much left to the states to decide for themselves. And different states had different approaches and different residency requirements. But for that first period, citizenship, even national citizenship, kind of began at a state level. And one of the issues in Dred Scott was whether or not states were going to be allowed to control who could become an American citizen, because northern states were granting citizenship to Black Americans. And if that were true, then if you were a free Black American, you could invoke the jurisdiction of the federal courts. And maybe if you were an enslaved Black American who was brought voluntarily to a free soil state, and thereby, under the rules of the laws of Massachusetts, become a free person, you now can sue in federal court to establish your freedom. So you had a rejection of this idea that this could be controlled on a state level in Dred Scott. The court refused to allow free states to grant their local Black residents citizenship and thereby make them citizens of the United States. So even though it had been left to the states before, Dred Scott then tries to make an anti-Black reading of the Constitution. It was one of the first things that Republicans wanted to address when, after the Civil War, when they began debating how to bring freedom to the newly emancipated Blacks in the South. So you get the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which also begins early in 1866, persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign government, excluding Indians not taxed, I think. It was an early attempt to finally bring a definition of citizenship to a national level. So we first began to talk about citizenship when we began to talk about adopting the 14th Amendment. So all of this conversation and all of this debate, I'm very hopeful, is going to make people more attentive than ever to that particular moment in our history when we took these issues so seriously and engaged in a deep debate for the first time on the nature of American citizenship. We're going to argue, but I think it'll be instructive for everyone.
We have just 1 minute left, and so before we go, of course, we want everybody to read the essays that you've written for this book and the other essays that will be in the book. If you could leave our audience with one last reading recommendation, either something you've alluded to already or something you haven't, what's the best thing that they could read about these themes when they leave today? Go ahead, Randy.
Absolutely, it's Sean Wilentz' No Property in Man, which tells a story that I was, as somebody who had been studying anti-slavery constitutionalism for 15 years, was unfamiliar with some of it. It's a paperback, it's very accessible. The Georgetown Center for the Constitution awarded it Salmon Chase book prize of $50,000 because we thought it was so outstanding. That would be the thing I would read first.
Thanks, Randy. Kurt?
What an enormous question. I'm simply going to agree with Randy. It's been very influential to me as well. A new idea about how the Declaration of Independence broke open the doors to freedom in a way that I hadn't appreciated before.
Great. And finally, Justin.
I will recommend Professor Danielle Allen's book on the Declaration of Independence. She's taught a course when she was at the University of Chicago during nights, where night students are really wrestling with the Declaration of Independence and its meanings. Her work in this area is significant.
Wonderful. Well, the next panel in a few moments will be A New Birth of Freedom with Diana Schaub and Lucas Morel. There'll be a small break in between, but before we break, please join me in thanking our guests today.
Hey.
Welcome back for our second panel after a really wonderful opening conversation this afternoon. We're going to think a little bit about the founding and its relation to slavery in this conversation through a lens that also came up quite a bit in the last one, which is the way in which this question was thought through in the 19th century. As the question of slavery grew increasingly unavoidable and contentious and ultimately paramount in American life. And as we'll see, it wasn't just the question of slavery in its own terms, but also the very question of how the founders thought about slavery that became a focal point for the divisions of that era. The very question that we're taking up today was also very much on Americans' minds in a very practical and significant way in those dark and dangerous middle decades of the 19th century. And we're going to think about that in part through the lens that we've already begun to think through of Frederick Douglass, in part, of course, through the thought of Abraham Lincoln, and then more broadly and more generally. And we'll do it with the help of just two ideal scholars to help us understand that moment and its thought and statesmanship. We'll hear first from Diana Schaub. Diana is, for our purposes, first and foremost, a non-resident senior fellow here at AEI. She is also a professor emerita of political science at Loyola University. Her work is focused on the history of political thought, but also in some very significant ways on exactly the questions we're thinking about here, the thought of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and African-American political thought. She's the author, most recently, of his greatest speeches, How Lincoln Moved the Nation, among a number of other important books, and she holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. We'll hear second from Lucas Morel, the John K. Boardman Professor of Politics at Washington and Lee University. He's also established himself really as one of America's foremost scholars of Lincoln's thought and statesmanship, the author of Lincoln and the American Founding, among other important books. He's also a member of the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, and so has had to think about this 250th quite a bit, and that's also an excuse to say semi-quincentennial, which I'm trying to practice
2 times.
in preparation for next year. And he holds a PhD from Claremont. These are two just spectacular scholars, and I think we're really in for a great conversation. Diana, please start us off.
Okay, because I have no pocket, I have to figure out what to do with this thing. In his most famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, already mentioned in the previous panel, it was delivered 76 years after 1776. And in that speech, Frederick Douglass found hope in the thought that the nation was young and might be capable of moral growth. Were the nation older, he said, the patriot's heart might be sadder. Our nation is now considerably older. with the approach of our semi-quincentennial year, must our hearts be sad. Perhaps there are grounds for hope in the fact that even old nations are continually refreshed by young citizens. Like the poor, the young will always be with us. But that means the task of education is always with us also. Birthright citizenship does not make citizens. Only a properly formative education can do that. Unfortunately, students today are largely shaped by their early and sustained miseducation. That miseducation involves not only failures of intellect, but a more profound disorder of the heart. For the most part, young Americans are not patriots. Indeed, they regard patriotism with suspicion. This creates a dilemma for civic learning, since all learning begins in love. Budding entomologists just love bugs. That kind of pure and simple attachment is not possible in the political realm. In my long experience as a college teacher, most students arrive with serious reservations about the American founding. And it turns out that those reservations are rooted in the American attachment to equality. Although students are unaware that their very objection pays tribute to the founders' Declaration of Equality as the premise of the nation. Instead of understanding how the founders shaped the moral commitments of succeeding generations, students have been instructed that the founders were either hypocrites or worse than hypocrites. Either they included blacks within the human family, in which case they were hypocrites for not immediately ending slavery and establishing equality, or they didn't even consider blacks to be human, in which case they were racist fools. Either interpretation leads young people to feel shame rather than gratitude towards their inheritance. I'm convinced that students will hold themselves aloof from civic learning until their moral qualms about the nation's origins are addressed. So, how to proceed? Frederick Douglass comes to our rescue, showing how a person of the utmost moral seriousness and intellectual integrity could move from a position of radical alienation to one of genuine attachment, and do so through a searching confrontation with the founding documents. Frederick Douglass demonstrates how grievance and gratitude can be balanced in thoughtful patriotism. Not surprisingly, Douglass viewed the United States from the perspective of the enslaved. His first impulse after his escape from enslavement was to denounce the nation, root and branch. That impulse led him to become a follower of William Lloyd Garrison, who radicalized the anti-slavery movement with his pronouncement that the U.S. Constitution was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. While today's students haven't the religious foundation or the powerful eloquence of the self-educated former slave, they would applaud his sentiments. How can I love a country that dooms 3 million of my brethren, some of them my own kindred, my own brothers, my own sisters, who are now clanking the chains of slavery upon the plains of the South, whose warm blood is now making fat the soil of Maryland and Alabama, and over whose crushed spirits rolls the dark shadow of oppression, shutting out and extinguishing forever the cheering rays of that bright sun of liberty, lighted in the souls of all God's children by the omnipotent hand of deity itself. For Douglass, this verdict committed him to revolution. He called for the Constitution to be shivered in 1,000 fragments. While some students today pursue an activist anti-Americanism, most young people draw a different lesson. Their hostility to America's disgraceful past compounds their pre-existing political apathy. As Tocqueville predicted, equality of conditions would lead Americans to withdraw into narrow self-absorption. Of course, it's a self-absorption that pays lip service to the reigning globalist humanitarianism. Like the Garrisonians, today's students are cosmopolitans, but that stance is now mostly shorn of its Garrisonian fervor. They are lazy, disaffected cosmopolitans. One reason why Frederick Douglass is so suited to our moment is that he was not content to remain alienated from the land of his birth. His quest to belong can be glimpsed even in his earliest expressions of non-belonging. In a letter written to Garrison from Belfast while Douglas was on an international speaking tour, Douglas begins by asserting, "As a nation, I belong to none. He is a sojourner abroad, welcomed on terms of equality and celebrated as a hero, but still an itinerant stranger." Despite his exile and deracination, Douglas calls the United States home. Repeatedly, he speaks of the land of my birth, from which he is an outcast and an outlaw. Douglas is self-reflective about his uprooted condition, which he recognizes as anomalous. That men should be patriotic is, he writes, perfectly natural. And as a philosophical fact, I am able to give it an intellectual recognition. But no further can I go. In his reflections upon the phenomenon of patriotism, Douglas points to a kind of natural, aesthetic attachment to one's native land, as well as a natural attachment to one's blood kin. Because of slavery, these two forms of love of one's own, which normally would be mutually reinforcing, are at odds. For Douglas, the blood claim of his sable brethren, and especially the warm blood of my outraged sisters, negates his American nativity. America, he says, will not allow her children to love her. The process by which Douglas became a patriot was a slow and arduous one. The longer paper on which my remarks this afternoon are based traces in painstaking detail each step along the way. But put in the briefest possible form, what I would say happened to Douglas was that he became a political being, attentive to the demands of persuasive speech and the ruling virtue of political prudence. It's important to remember just how radically apolitical, anti-political the Garrisonians were. Many of them were what was called, they were no government men, pacifists, millenarian utopians. From their perspective, slavery was just the most visible form of the violence endemic to all human rule. Garrison and his disciples relied on divine law to condemn American sinfulness. Their text was the Bible, their favored genre of speech, the Jeremiad. Although the Garrisonians certainly agreed with the Declaration's assertion that all men are created equal, they didn't really attempt to use the Declaration as an anti-slavery resource, viewing it instead as a giant fraud from the get-go. For the Garrisonians, morality and politics were simply irreconcilable. During his travels through the British Isles, however, Douglas met abolitionists who considered themselves the warmest friends of America and American institutions. He remarks that he frequently saw the American Declaration of Independence on display in their parlors. He tells of a Dubliner whose home featured a very expensively framed copy of the Declaration. This aged anti-slavery gentleman confessed that he was often tempted to turn its face to the wall. It is such a palpable contradiction of the spirit and practices of the American people at this time. Douglas, though, eventually drew a different lesson. If the problem is the abandonment of the founding principles by subsequent generations, if it is the sons of the fathers who have turned the Declaration's face to the wall, then a better strategy might be to restore the Declaration to its original prominence. Revolution, in its literal and conservative meaning of revolving back to the starting point, might be a promising path. While the Garrisonians denounced slavery as sin, Douglas began to focus more on slavery as a violation of rights. The shift is subtle. Certainly, Douglas grounds his understanding of human beings as rights-bearing individuals in equal creation by God. But over time, his language becomes more political and less exclusively religious. As he proceeded along this new path, Douglas began to formulate a definition of patriotism that privileges dissent. I will hold up America to the lightning scorn of moral indignation. In doing this, he said, I shall feel myself discharging the duty of a true patriot. After Douglas returned from almost 2 years abroad, he relocated from Boston, the center of Garrisonian abolitionism, to Rochester, New York, where he then launched his own newspaper, the North Star, and he launched it with the bold announcement that we shall try to have a mind of our own. He more than delivered on that aspiration. Once out of the orbit of the Garrisonians, Douglas undertook what he called a reconsideration of the whole subject. In the upshot, he completely reversed his position on 4 key matters: disunionism, pacifism, the non-voting principle, and the pro-slavery character of the U.S. Constitution. In his autobiography, he says that he studied with some care not only the just and proper rules of legal interpretation, but the origin, design, nature, rights, powers, and duties of civil government, and also the relations which human beings sustain to it. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Frederick Douglass discovered political philosophy, and it cured him of Garrisonianism, and it gave him his country back. Douglass's reconsideration, at least initially, focused almost entirely on the question of whether the Constitution was a pro-slavery or an anti-slavery compact. As early as February 1849, Douglas was prepared to admit that if strictly construed, in other words, just the words alone, the document was not pro-slavery. However, that admission at that point meant little to him, since he didn't think that the letter of the law should determine interpretation. Instead, as he explained, quote, the original intent and meaning of the Constitution, that is, the one given to it by the men who framed it, those who adopted it, the one given to it by the Supreme Court of the United States, makes it a pro-slavery instrument. While Douglas sees the political advantage of Lysander Spooner's constitutional literalism, in other words, if it doesn't say slave, it doesn't mean slave, and remember, the word slave and slavery never appears in the original Constitution. Douglas sees how that might be a kind of political advantage, but he's not prepared to adopt it. He remains fixed in his view of the founders' nefarious intentions. He believes that the absence of the word slave or slavery from the Constitution simply indicates the wicked cunning of the drafters, who were ashamed of the name of their crime, but adept in devising federal protection for it. Even while forcefully forwarding this Garrisonian interpretation of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, Douglas, as editor of the North Star, takes the very un-Garrisonian step of saying that he is prepared to hear all sides and to give a candid consideration to the views of Spooner and Gerrit Smith and others associated with the Liberty Party. They were the sort of political action abolitionists. And they asserted the anti-slavery character of the Constitution. Now, I already indicated my belief that today's students could benefit by following along with Douglas as he weighs the evidence, as he changes his mind. But maybe more important than the substantive transformation is the attitude of truth-seeking humility that makes such transformation possible. Douglas refuses to regard his current position on the Constitution as correct beyond the possibility of an honest doubt. By granting a hearing, inviting a hearing to those who disagree with him, he's not allowed to dismiss them. He's not allowed to say that they are bent upon making the worse appear the better reason. Now, of course, there is such a thing as sophistry, and Douglas was convinced that John C. Calhoun was a sophist. But it must be proven, not assumed. Start from the arguments rather than the ascription of motives. What enabled Douglas to finally reconcile morality with politics? Certainly the results are clear. The reconciliation that he achieved made him pro-union, He now started to argue that slavery would be abolished only through the Union, not through the Union's dismemberment. It made him pro-political party, and he was then faced with difficult decisions. Should he support only Liberty Party candidates? Should he support more moderate and free soil candidates and eventually Republican Party candidates? And it made him pro-slave insurrection. Hence his endorsement of resistance to the fugitive slave law and his financial support for John Brown. Never does Douglas say that he switched to a Machiavellian calculus, that one can do evil that good may come. My view is that Douglas did remain a man of principle. He didn't give up on doing rightly, but he did add the virtue of political prudence to his understanding of what constitutes a principled life. Prudence permits one to choose the lesser of two evils. Let me just say a word about the final stage of Douglas's conversion. Unlike some of his new mentors, especially Lysander Spooner, dean of the anti-slavery constitutionalists, Douglas did not fling to the winds the question of authorial intention. Whereas Spooner, who looked only at the words themselves, disallowed all speculations as to the opinions of the Constitution makers, Douglas says something a little different. He says, I am only in reason and in conscience bound to learn the intentions of those who framed the Constitution in the Constitution itself. So for Douglas, intention still matters, and it is discoverable in the text. The text is the record of its maker's intention, an intention that can then be confirmed through knowledge of the historical record. And over the decade of the 1850s, Douglas's interest in the founders grew as he developed a very sophisticated reading of the text, which did not scorn research into the wider context. In a certain sense, I think you can say that both the extreme Garrisonian pro-slavery reading and the extreme Spoonerian anti-slavery reading, both of those interpretations were the creation of purists. As soon as Douglas saw compromise in a document or in an institution or in a person, he rejected it as hopelessly compromised, a pact with the devil. Spooner was an absolutist of sorts also. He simply refused to see any compromise with slavery in the Constitution. The Charter was worthy of support because it was pure. It had an admirable preamble, and that preamble controlled the meaning of each provision and invalidated any interpretation that it was at odds with true justice. Yet, for most Americans who did know something of their history, Spooner's literalism seemed like a kind of semantic trick. I mean, it's true that the words slave and slavery don't appear in the Constitution, but what about the thing? Is it there? And if so, what does that mean about our ability to swear an oath to the Constitution? What Douglas achieved in the end, in the final speech, that 1860 speech, the Glasgow speech, is where this is most clear. What Douglas achieved was a vindication of the founders' intent. Instead of denying the presence of compromises in the document, he re-examined key provisions to see whether they amounted to a compromise of the principle of human liberty. Is it possible to construct a compromise that isn't compromising? The paradox here is a permanent one. Should we celebrate the spirit of compromise and mutual concession? Should we venerate those statesmen who ingeniously craft modes of adjustment that pacify intestine feuds? Should we lament the rise of extremists for whom compromise is a dirty word? Yes, yes, and yes. And yet, compromise is sometimes a dirty word. She compromised herself and all she ever stood for. They were discovered in a compromising position. As Douglas's experience of the world grew, he became more discerning in his evaluations of the proper types of and times for compromise. Unlike, say, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass never joined in the admiration for Henry Clay. the great compromiser, author of the Missouri Compromise and the Compromises of 1850. But Frederick Douglass did come to value the prudence spoken of in the Declaration of Independence and the principle-preserving practical compromises devised by the anti-slavery delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And I think that the result of this realignment on Douglas's part can be seen in the first great speech that he delivered after his 1851 change of opinion. Here I think I'm going to quarrel a bit with Justin's reading of the 4th of July address. In that speech, everybody knows Douglas savages the government, he savages the church, he savages society of the day with all of his usual force. But what is new and important about that speech is that the scathing denunciation is sandwiched between two sections that celebrate the nation's founding charters. Douglas begins the speech with praise for the Declaration, and he ends it with praise for the Constitution. Moreover, for the first time in any of his speechifying, he addresses his audience as fellow citizens. So the July 4th address stands as his most extensive tribute to the Revolution. And above all, Douglas credits the saving principles of the Declaration. Of the statesmen, patriots, and heroes who contended for those principles, Douglas insists that their fight was not for themselves alone. Quote, their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength to the distant future. I think it's worth noting that Douglas characterizes the revolutionary generation as having declared for liberty. Repeatedly, Douglas invokes liberty, never mentioning equality, although he does twice add justice. So he links liberty and justice. Now, let me remind you, the title of our panel, Slavery, Equality, and the American Revolution. Our tendency, I think, is the same as that of our students. We see slavery as a violation of the Declaration's equality principle. And of course it is. Nonetheless, I think that Douglas's focus on liberty is the more natural and the more sound approach. The real objection to enslavement is not that it treats other persons or groups unequally, but that it deprives the enslaved of their liberty. After all, one could remedy the inequality by enslaving everyone, a possibility of degenerate democracy about which Tocqueville warned us. So what mattered to Douglas was the moral content associated with equality. Was there equality of rights, equality of liberty? Douglas's autobiography is entitled My Bondage and My Freedom. Keeping that opposition in mind, I think, is an important corrective for us today when the notion of equality has sort of gone off the straight and narrow rails laid out by the individual natural rights to life and liberty. All right, let me wrap this up. We've seen that Douglas's remarkable journey didn't cease when he became physically free from enslavement. He sought a fuller form of freedom. He sought political freedom. But before he could agitate for citizenship and equal rights, civil rights, Douglas had to discover himself to be a political being. He had to find a way to belong to the political community. He became a patriot. He came to regard whites, even those who declined his fellowship, as fellow citizens. And he developed the virtues required of citizens, learning to listen as well as to speak. Something like Douglas's roundabout journey back to 1776 must be taken by students today who often begin from a place of alienation, political alienation. With any luck, they will end up where Douglas did, advising his July 4th audience to cling to this day, cling to it and to its principles with the grasp of a storm-tossed mariner to a spar at midnight.
Thanks, Yuval, for inviting me back to AEI. I think the last time I was here was a conversation about Frederick Douglass with Diana Schaub. Rule number one, never follow Diana Schaub. I'm here to talk about Lincoln and equality. Lincoln once said that public opinion, quote, always has a central idea from which all its minor thoughts radiate. He thought that in America, that idea at the beginning was, and until recently has continued to be, the equality of men. He made that comment in December 1856. This was after the defeat of the Republican Party's first candidate for president, John C. Fremont. Lincoln argued that the election of the Democratic candidate, James Buchanan, the doughface from Pennsylvania, he said that that was a struggle by one party to discard that central idea, to substitute for it the opposite idea that slavery is right. If not opposed, he believed it would produce, quote, the perpetuity of human slavery, its extension to all countries and colors, rather than what he saw was the steady progress towards the practical equality of all men that had marked the development of American self-government. And so over the next 4 years, Lincoln would battle rhetorically for the mantle of the American founders, and especially to reclaim human equality as the central idea, the meaning of America. But weren't the founders racists because of their slaveholding? To be sure, in the midst of fighting for their right to govern themselves, they did not abolish slavery right away. Lincoln argued that when Americans fought for independence and then framed the Constitution, they were, quote, in a certain sense compelled to tolerate slavery. It was a sort of necessity, he said. However, they viewed it as an evil not to be extended, and within the federal system sought what he called the peaceful extinction of slavery, that is to say, the eradication of slavery through political means. These are his words in 1858. I think that was the condition in which we found ourselves when we established this government. We had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. Having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties. That charter was what Lincoln called that old Declaration of Independence. And of course, he made a habit of quoting the line about all men being created equal. He said, lose sight of this principle, and it would tend to rub the sentiment of liberty, rub it out of the country, and would transform this government into a government of some other form. But the idea of getting right with the founders wasn't unique to Lincoln. In fact, the two main alternatives to the Republican Party during the all-so-pivotal 1860 presidential campaign and the ensuing secession winter both appealed to the American founders. Northern Democrats supported Lincoln's longtime rival, the Illinois Senator Stephen Arnold Douglas. And this is Douglas. Douglas referred to our revolutionary fathers. He said that they were unconcerned about the future of slavery in America. He claimed the founders endorsed what he called popular sovereignty as a kind of political, and this was his word, diversity. That was the word he used for federalism. In his first formal debate with Lincoln in 1858, he said, quote, our fathers intended that our institutions should differ. And he added, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, and the great men of that day made this government divided into free states and slave states, left each state perfectly free to do as it pleased on the subject of slavery. Again, the fathers of the revolution, he said, and the sages who made the Constitution well understood that the great varieties of soil, of production, of interests in a republic as large as this required different local and domestic regulations in each locality, adapted to the wants and interests of each separate state. On the other hand, this is the bad stuff, according to Douglas, uniformity in local and domestic affairs would be destructive of state rights, of state sovereignty, of personal liberty and personal freedom. Uniformity is the parent of despotism the world over, not only in politics, but in religion. And so Douglas argued, Stephen Douglas, by insisting on racial equality, Lincoln was seeking, quote, one consolidated empire, end quote. And you know, in the time of the founding, that was the C word, consolidation. So he thought better for Congress to butt out, not to interfere with the domestic institutions of either the states or the federal territories. So that's the Northern Democrats. In 1860, Southern Democrats nominated the sitting vice president, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Breckinridge said, "The government our fathers gave us enshrined equality of the states of the Union." That was the fundamental principle of the Constitution. He said that Constitution was framed and transmitted by the wisest generation of men that lived. The principles upon which it was originally framed comprised not only state equality, but also what he called equality of the rights of citizens in their persons and property, which of course included property in human beings. In a September 1860 campaign speech, Breckinridge argued that, quote, the common territories of the Union were open to the common settlement from all the states. He insisted on the right of Southern slave owners to settle in federal territory with their slaves. It would be, as it were, discriminating against Southern white men if you told them they couldn't take their black slaves to the territories. Adhering to the notorious 1857 Dred Scott opinion of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, Breckinridge claimed that between slave property and other property, no distinction exists. Therefore, Congress has, quote, the power coupled with the duty of guarding and protecting the owner in his rights in federal territory. Although the speech was designed to unite Democrats around one candidate, around him, by getting Stephen Douglas to leave or withdraw from the race, he didn't forget the Republican candidate. He said Lincoln, quote, represents the most obnoxious principles in issue in this canvass. He said those principles were clearly unconstitutional because they disregarded Taney's ruling in Dred Scott, which had interpreted the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment to guarantee a federal right of property, including slaves. And so, as I think, 1860 was really a referendum on whose interpretation of the American founding was correct. But in the decade leading up to the 1860 presidential election, Lincoln's appeal to the American founding was not directed at slave-owning Southerners. They had long since rejected the view that slavery was, as Lincoln put it, a necessary evil. They had defended it as a positive good for both the master and the slave. Lincoln's main concern was that white Northerners would be tempted by Stephen Douglas's version of popular sovereignty, precisely because it was neutral on the slave question. Douglas believed that whites at the local level, again, whether in states or territories, had the right to decide the question without interference or intervention from Congress. In reference to the enslavement of black people out west, Douglas said, I don't care whether it be voted up or down. He didn't think his position as a U.S. senator should have any influence, let alone any authority over whether slavery was permitted out there. This indicated to Lincoln that the greatest obstacle to stopping the spread of slavery in the United States was Douglas persuading white Northerners not to care about the plight of black people in the territories. Lincoln's words, they tell us that they desire the people of a territory to vote slavery out or in as they please. The question arises, slavery or freedom? Caring nothing about it, they let it come in. And that is the end of it. It is the surest way of nationalizing the institution. Just as certain, but more dangerous because more insidious. But it is leading us there just as certainly and as surely as Jeff Davis himself would have us go. This policy, this don't care policy of Douglas's, was insidious, Lincoln said, because it would make slavery national without a single politician north of the Mason-Dixon line actually arguing in favor of slavery. Simply get white Americans in the free states not to care if the enslavement of black people became legal in federal territory. Once slavery was accepted as a constitutional right in the territories, it would soon become a federal right in the free states, regardless of what those states' constitutions or laws said. If white Northerners agreed with Douglas that Congress did not have authority to regulate the domestic, that is to say the local institutions of the territories, then Douglas's declared indifference, as Lincoln put it, would actually represent covert, real zeal for the spread of slavery. Lincoln warned that this version of popular sovereignty, coupled with the Dred Scott ruling, would set this policy in motion in the not-too-distant future. So Lincoln's solution was a call, an appeal to the American people to, quote, readopt the Declaration of Independence, end quote. In so doing, they would not only have saved the Union, but in his words, so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. Following the example of the founders, as we learned earlier, they banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, first under the Articles of Confederation, then under the Constitution. A country worthy of the saving needed to be a country that limited the spread of slavery as a step towards its eventual demise. So Lincoln made a correct view of the American founding central to the nation's response to alternative interpretations promoted by influential figures just like, or such as Chief Justice Taney and Senator Douglas. Senator Douglas, in my estimation, in the 1850s was not the most important Democrat. He was the most important politician in the United States. Beginning in 1850, what Clay failed to do with the compromise measures, it was Douglas that got that through Congress. Then, of course, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then defeating Lincoln in 1858. Unlike Lincoln, Taney and Douglas thought the principles of the Declaration were true, but only for white people. And they read it that way to defend the slaveholding founders from charges of hypocrisy. So here is Taney in the Dred Scott opinion. The enslaved African race were not intended to be included, formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. For if the languages understood in that day would embrace them, the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. That's Taney. Here's Douglas, echoing this reading, this interpretation of the Declaration just 1 year later in his debates with Lincoln. Are you willing to have it said that every man who signed the Declaration of Independence declared the Negro his equal and then was hypocrite enough to continue to hold him as a slave in violation of what he believed to be the divine law? Douglas inferred, plausibly enough, that on Lincoln's reading, black people into the Declaration, the founders were, quote, bound as conscientious men that day and that hour, not only to have abolished slavery throughout the land, but to have conferred political rights and privileges on the Negro, elevated him to an equality with the white man. Their decision not to free their slaves, quote, shows that they did not understand the language they used in the Declaration to include any but the white race. So the social context, I believe, would shape how Lincoln and Stephen Douglas appealed, especially to the citizenry of Illinois. White supremacy there was not the exception, but the rule. The few blacks that lived there possessed very few civil rights and no political rights. According to the 1848 Constitution, only white males could vote or serve in the state militia. Illinois statutes barred blacks from serving on juries and offering testimony against whites in courts. And in 1853, the infamous Logan Act was an act that prevented, quote, the immigration of free Negroes into this state, end quote. Douglas routinely exploited the racial animus of white Illinoisans by calling Lincoln's political party the Black Republican Party or the Abolition Party. At least at that time, abolitionists were a fringe element of society. You didn't invite them to your parties, all that stuff. For his part, Lincoln responded by tying the future security of the rights of white people to the present insecurity of the rights of black people. Given the color prejudice of most white Illinoisans, given that no blacks were even allowed to vote in that state in 1858, what is extraordinary is that Lincoln kept bringing up the natural rights of black people during his debates with Douglas, explicitly reading blacks in, not outside of, the Declaration of Independence. Even when he appealed to the self-interest of bigoted white Illinoisans, Lincoln never did so without showing them the true basis of their rights, namely the Declaration's principle of human equality. His hope was that white prejudice would eventually yield to the claims of their common humanity with all human beings, regardless of race. In his critique of Taney's Dred Scott ruling, Lincoln elaborated on the meaning of equality in the Declaration. He said of the founders, quote, they did not mean to assert the obvious untruth, that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right, so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. So Lincoln understood the founders not as hypocritical politicians, but as what I would call prudent revolutionaries. They recognized that in addition to longstanding prejudice, to be sure, and economic self-interest, circumstances like a war with Great Britain and a potential war between the races would prevent immediate mass emancipation in any state, especially those with a significant slave population. So simply put, at the time of the founding, Americans did not believe they could both free themselves and free their slaves at the same time. To do so would jeopardize their efforts to secure and maintain their independence from England. The success of the American Revolution would require a united effort by the American states, a unity the states continued to see as essential, not optional, once independence was achieved. Lincoln believed that to form a more perfect union, the founders had to make compromises to establish a viable national government. In their minds, liberty required independence, independence required unity, and unity required compromises. So slavery would remain a state institution that the Constitutional Convention accommodated for the sake of maintaining the Union of American states. Lincoln also went on to observe that the founders' inaction regarding enslaved blacks in America was similar to the founders' inaction toward free whites in America. While it was obvious that equality was not secured for black people on American soil, Lincoln pointed out the less obvious fact that the founders, quote, did not at once or ever afterwards actually place all white people on an equality with one another, end quote. For example, in the early decades following American independence, some states employed property and religious qualifications to limit the right to vote. So not all white people were made equal in their civil or political rights. Lincoln surmised that the Declaration set up what he called a standard maxim for free society, which could be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence, augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors, everywhere. While natural rights were the birthright of every person, civil and political rights would depend on the sentiment of the community. What Lincoln, along with the American founders, called a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, Stephen Douglas called, quote, a monstrous heresy, end quote. Douglas eventually appealed explicitly to white supremacy as a Union-saving measure after Lincoln was elected in November 1860. An election, as you know, that provoked South Carolina to dissolve its union with the rest of the American states in December 20th and 24th. So on Christmas Eve Day, December 24th, 1860, Stephen Douglas proposed 2 constitutional amendments. His 14th article, it would have been our 14th Amendment. This is the first line of it. And think of the current 14th Amendment in light of this one. Here's what Douglas said should become a part of the Constitution. The elective franchise and the right to hold office, whether federal, state, territorial, or municipal, shall not be exercised by persons of the African race in whole or in part, end quote. So the contrast between Douglas's 14th Amendment and the one that actually passed during Reconstruction could not be more striking. Where the latter 14th Amendment speaks of the equal protection of the laws, Douglas sought a constitutional ban against black people from even voting or holding political office at any level in any place in the United States. If there is anything that distinguishes Lincoln's approach to the problem of racial slavery in America from Douglas's, it is Lincoln's consistent attempt to get white Americans to acknowledge what they shared, what they had in common with black Americans, and that was their equal possession of natural rights. A year before he was elected president, Lincoln was invited to speak in Boston to mark the anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's birth. Instead of making the trip, he sent a letter extolling Jefferson's achievement in drafting the Declaration. He wrote that the principles of Jefferson are the definitions and axioms of a free society. Lincoln drew from his study of Euclid's geometry to picture the Declaration's principles as the building blocks of democracy. But he acknowledged that even self-evident truths can be denied and evaded, as was the case when he wrote that letter in 1859. Nevertheless, he insisted, this is a world of compensations. He who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. And then he alluded to Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia by adding, those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. These were astounding words for Lincoln, the Republican and former Whig, to utter, given that Jefferson was one of the founders of the Democratic Party. Still, Lincoln declared all honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times, and so to embalm it there that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. In looking back to Jefferson, Lincoln looked back to a founding generation that put the principles of self-government in writing, principles he invited fellow citizens to recognize as the true source of their rights, and that obligated them, therefore, to eliminate slavery, as he put it, as fast as circumstances should permit. Lincoln's campaign for president in 1860, I believe, was the culmination of efforts begun back in 1854, running through that decade to remind the American people of the true basis of their rights and the constitutional path to the eventual abolition of slavery. His was one of 3 clear paths presented to the American people in 1860 at a critical time, the most critical time in our history. And for Lincoln, it was the Declaration's equality principle that was the lodestar of his political thought. He defined that principle as, in one place in a note to himself, he called it the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all. It reflected what he called the justice of the Creator to his creatures. And he added, yes, gentlemen, to all his creatures, to the whole great family of man. In their enlightened belief, nothing stamped with the divine image and likeness was sent into the world to be trodden on, degraded, and imbruted by its fellows. I believe Lincoln's speeches as a citizen and president, as well as actions that both preserved the American Union and emancipated slaves, were the primary reason white supremacy did not become a systemic part of American national government. The American people at that election rejected both the positive good argument for the enslavement of black people and toleration of the spread of racial slavery under Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty policy. Lincoln's interpretation of the Declaration prevailed with its principle of human equality understood as an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. Lincoln became the greatest defender of the American founding, not only by fighting to preserve the Union of American states, but also by fighting to restore the principle of equality as the central idea of America. In doing so, he taught subsequent generations the true principles of self-government. These, I believe, can still help Americans find common ground for promoting a common future as a united and free people. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for really rich, wonderful comments. One of the advantages we have in having the two of you on this panel is that each of you has written about both Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And
Not correcting each other.
not so far, but I'm going to work on that. Okay. We can think a little bit about the differences between them. And one of the striking differences in listening to you talk about their priorities is that it does seem, Diana, that Douglas emphasizes the Constitution, not the Declaration, in trying to persuade Americans, and in becoming persuaded himself in public of the possibility that the founding is in fact not a pro-slavery moment. Yeah. It would seem more obvious to look to the Declaration of Independence, and yet he seems to almost decide not to do that. Why the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the Declaration is there, but you're right to pick up this difference. Many of the, the great speeches from Douglas really focus on the Constitution and his change of heart about the nature of the Constitution. So that was key for him in breaking away from the Garrisonians. I mean, in part, it's just reflective of the fact that the battle that was going on was a battle over the nature of the Constitution. Americans are a constitutional people. Every controversial issue becomes a constitutional issue, and slavery was the issue of the day, the crisis of the House divided, and that was a battle over the nature of the Constitution. So he really did focus on the Constitution. I think that for Lincoln, I mean, Lincoln is also a dedicated constitutionalist. You go back to the Lyceum Address, which says, what will save the nation? We have a political religion of law-abidingness, of fidelity to the Constitution and laws. But I think by the 1850s, Lincoln realized that the breakdown of constitutionalism was so complete, and the only way to put the nation back on track was to do what Lucas mentioned, that we had to return to a unified sentiment on the wrongness of slavery, and that was what had to be done. And for Lincoln, that made the Declaration primary.
Lucas, how do you think about that difference?
Yeah, I think that difference is there, and I wouldn't disagree with anything that Diana said. I would just add that for Douglas, in a way, he didn't think he needed to persuade people who already believed in human equality. They needed to have permission to read the Constitution a little differently, and that a little differently really is a lot differently. Here's where where Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln actually part ways. Lincoln actually believed, like you said, is the thing there or ain't it? And it's there. And Douglas does not want to concede rhetorically that the thing is there. He wanted white Northerners
to give themselves permission to interpret that document as one that did not countenance slavery, as something that was protected, right? The mission statement is in the preamble. If it's so important to people, why didn't they ever mention it, right? They talk about the blessings of liberty, they talk about justice. Where's slavery? Not to be found, right? All the euphemisms. And so Douglas's beef with Northerners, especially white Northerners, was not, well, hey, I need to persuade you that all men are created equal. He lived in Boston and then Rochester. Most of those people, at least in theory, conceded human equality. But they would always come back and say, but the compromises, but the compromises. And Douglas said, no, that refers to indentured servants, or that refers to this or that. That doesn't refer to slaves. So you can and have a duty to interpret the Constitution as you see it. You don't need a law degree. He's very specific about this. That Constitution doesn't belong. Sorry, I got some law professors here. You have all the good lawyer jokes. I'm not going to mention one here. But he said you don't need a law degree to interpret your own Constitution. And so what is the only thing we got that emanated from a convention that met in secret, for crying out loud, was the text. James Madison himself, right, kept his notes not secret, but he purposely did not allow those notes to become public until after his death. That's not until the 1840s. When that happens, what does everybody do? Everybody, the pro-slavery and anti-slavery guys, start pouring over Madison's notes to figure out what were the intentions. And in a way, we see with Douglas, he's the most Madisonian of all. He's like, Madison told us not to look at his own notes. They were the most copious notes. He said to work out the meaning has to be in the conversation of the people who were deciding on whether or not to make that thing their thing, right? Are we going to throw out our current Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, Perpetual Union, and replace them with this new thing that talks about an electoral college? What on earth is that, right? That's the relevant conversation, the conversations and the ratifying debates, not what happened by X number of men meeting in secret who had everyone their own intentions about the document. What does everybody have in common? It's in English, the document itself, and Douglas says, here, I can explain with Lysander Spooner's help and Goodell and Smith, I can tell you more or less within the four corners what this thing means. It's yours. You don't have to apologize. It is a pro-freedom Constitution.
Actually, one more thing on the Declaration and where it does show up more in Douglas's writing, and that's in relation to his advocacy of violence. So I mentioned that at the same time that Douglas changes his mind about the Constitution, he also rejects the pacifism of the Garrisonians. And so in a piece like, his response to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law and the attempts to enforce the new Fugitive Slave Law, he writes an editorial called, "Is It Right and Wise to Kill a Kidnapper?" And the kidnapper he has in mind are federal marshals who are enforcing the Fugitive Slave Law. So there his reasoning is very foundational. It's basically John Locke. You have a right to resist tyrannical government, and that really is drawn from the language of the Declaration. So I do think actually in his advocacy of violence especially in the early 1850s, that is associated with the role of the Declaration. He does the same thing in the autobiography, where he says that the slaveholders get what's coming to them, and every time they forward their subscription to the Declaration, they slit their own throats.
Well, we have just a few more minutes, so let me just invite you to think of questions you might have, and we'll take those up in just a moment. I wondered, Anna, if this is also how you would explain the difference between them on the emphasis of liberty versus equality, which is an interesting point you brought out. It does seem like Lincoln does want to revert to equality anytime he can, and Douglas really does want to talk about liberty almost instead.
Yeah, again, it's on Lincoln. I mean, you gave the quote about liberty to all, Right.
That's
the
from a
meaning,
fragment, yeah.
But in a way, that's Lincoln's understanding of the meaning of equality is liberty to all.
Sure.
So I don't see them actually as disagreeing about that. I mean, the proper understanding of the two concepts are intertwined. They are part of that package of self-evident truths from the Declaration. But at the same time, there is this kind of manly element in Douglas. And so for him, often the stress is on liberty.
Sure, let's take a
online,
question from
online audience.
the internet horde.
Douglas dies in 1895 as Jim Crow was throttling black rights in the South. Was he optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the country at the end of his life? What happens to the memory of the Revolution after Reconstruction?
I don't know. I mean, we both. I think there is an unquenchable hopefulness in Douglas. And so there are times, where he is very low. And that period of the 1880s and 1890s, things are not going in a good direction. He's very aware of what's happening. One of his last great speeches was on the topic of lynching. But I think he never loses his hopefulness. And so there's a famous story about a young man who comes to Douglas late in Douglas's life and says, what can I do for the cause? And Douglas is supposed to have said, agitate, agitate, agitate.
Yeah, I think, and again, this doesn't rebut what Diana said, but for every statement you can hear of Douglas, this almost superhuman hopefulness, right? Dred Scott passes by almost unanimous court, only 2 dissenters. He's like, oh, things have never looked better, because of the backlash it provoked, even though it's 7-2. Yeah. That's a slam dunk today. He just had this indefatigable hopefulness. However, decades after the Emancipation Proclamation, he calls it a stupendous fraud, right? He says, how can you free us from enslavement to an individual and not give us the vote or enforce the vote? That makes us enslaved to the white majority. And so the fact that good grief, he's making arguments against colonization in the 1890s. Yeah. I mean, how frustrating can that be, right? We were here before there was a here. And he's got to explain why Black Americans for generations, why they should consider themselves Americans on American soil, right? So I think, I don't know, maybe depended on what mood you found him in, but he never wanted people to lose hope, because for him, the only levers, the only game in town is the Constitution. It's the Declaration. I mean, that's, show me Plan B, right? You can't improve on these, right? He called it in the 1852 speech, the very ring bolt of this nation's destiny. And that's a pretty important part of a ship. You don't lose sight of that, right? If these principles are right, and he called them saving principles, then those can't be improved on. So all he can do is hope that, what did King say many decades later? All we ask is that you be true to what you said on paper, right? If you said something different, like if we had adopted, for example, the Confederate States of America Constitution, right? They're very clear, right? Negro slavery, that phrase shows up more than once there. Can't touch it, right? It is unconstitutional to ban slavery in the Confederate Constitution, okay? At least from the Confederate Congress, not the states, okay? They're very explicit on systemic injustice. They're very explicit. This is a white person's country, okay? And so for Douglas, we didn't have that Constitution. The levers of freedom are there. We just gotta step up to it.
Yeah, this is in fact why it was so important to Douglas to get that 15th Amendment. I think he knew that it was not going to be enforced. I mean, that it would have, that after a period, what happened, what did happen, he was aware that that was a possibility. But he thought it was so crucial to get it into the Constitution, because once it's there, it then becomes a weapon. That's another reason why I think he put more focus on the Constitution than the Declaration. What the political action abolitionists were trying to do was to weaponize the Constitution, make the Constitution a real force in the anti-slavery battle.
Yeah, in the back, please.
Many microphones. Hello. I have a question mainly for Diana Shaw, but I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts. I guess the question is, can you really be a patriot if you think that your society is radically unjust in the way that Frederick Douglass thought? The motivation for asking this is that if we call Douglass a patriot, even in the later Douglass, not the Garrisonian Douglass, that Douglass still thinks that his society is radically unjust. And so it seems like he doesn't have a patriotism that says something like, my country is good, but he has a patriotism maybe that says, well, I need to appeal to this kind of nationalist imaginary to motivate people to fight for justice. But right now, my country is pretty terrible.
No, it's a good question. I mean, that's why this moment of transformation where he changes his mind about the nature of the Constitution is so important, because now he can be a patriot. It's not something imaginary. It's our founding charter. And it's there. Americans take an oath to live by it. And so now the task, as Lucas said, is just to get Americans to live up to what they put down on paper. And that's a different task. In other words, he can now say, I am the true heir of the founders, and it's the sons of the fathers who have betrayed the revolution. And I think that's actually what he's really doing in that 4th of July address. There's a very curious moment as he makes the transition from the praise of the Declaration to the attack on the current generation, on the sons of the fathers. And he says, well, Americans like to hear praise of themselves, and so I will leave the praise of America to those whose regular descent from those men is less likely to be questioned than mine. In other words, Douglass has just indicated, guess what? I'm a biological son of the founders too. I am at least half white. But I'm the natural son of the founders, and you guys are the by marriage, legitimate, recognized sons of the founders. But guess which one is the true son? The natural son is the true son. And all of the rest of you are betraying that founding. That's a very powerful position. And it seems to me that is real patriotism. So he no longer, once he's made this change, had this change of heart, change of interpretation, he no longer believes that the nation is fundamentally unjust. He believes the nation is fundamentally just.
I guess, can you be more specific? Because when you say the nation, what is actually more just?
I'm sorry, what is?
What is the thing that is unjust? You said the nation, but is it the people, the institutions, the principles?
Well, yeah, I mean, look at the middle of the 4th of July address. It's the government, it's the churches, it's the social life and beliefs. I mean, that is a scathing denunciation of the current generation. But the way you condemn that current generation is by holding them up to the standards articulated in the founding.
Yeah, so you hold on to the Declaration, you hold on to the Constitution, you hold on to the Bible, right? So these are the things that, in his reading, are the things that are being, that the current generation is failing to live up to. I teach the 1852 speech every year, and the first portion of that speech, he is studiously silent about the slaveholding of the founders. The only time he mentions it is when he mentions that Washington couldn't die until he freed his slaves, right? He does so famously in his will. Why does he leave out what everybody knows is true? Right? Go ahead.
Yeah, but I would say, I mean, there certainly is the focus on the founding charters. But,
and the founders themselves, he calls them heroic.
So he actually, he believes that the founding generation handled the dilemma of slavery better than subsequent generations. So he is prepared to grant that they did the best they could in the conditions that confronted them. They put the nation on a path towards the abolition of slavery, and various things happened to cause us to go off that path.
Let me ask you as teachers, I mean, what you're getting at here is a challenge for the ambition you set out, Diana, which is to use Douglas to help contemporary students move from their own rejection of the founders and their legitimacy in the direction of patriotism. In a sense, Douglas is working in a time when the current generation is demonstrably worse than the generation of the founders in relation to race and slavery. When he can actually point to an example of the founders being better than we are, we're in a different situation. And approaching today's students and trying to help them see how they should think about the founders, these students, at least where they start, can begin by imagining that actually they're better than the founders, we're better than the founders, because we don't begin from a place of hypocrisy. And yet they assert these principles to us, and we're supposed to take them seriously. How do we use Douglas, how do we use Lincoln to help these students out of that dilemma?
Yeah, that's interesting. So it is in certain respects a different situation, and yet I think they immediately respond to Douglas and the early Douglas, the Garrisonian Douglas, because they share that negative assessment of the documents and of the founding. So, yeah, it does require a kind of development of historical imagination. They have to put themselves into Douglas's shoes. But it seems to me it's easier for them to step quickly, immediately into Douglas's shoes than it is to step into the shoes of Jefferson, for instance. I mean, there's just they don't want to give any benefit of the doubt to Jefferson.
Yeah. Lucas, how do you think about this challenge as a teacher? How do you help students get to that place?
Yeah, well, I teach a class called Lincoln Statesmanship, and I begin class by saying, look, I have clearly made up my mind. This is Lincoln, decent politician, question mark. I have already come to that conclusion, but I said, for them, the task is not to convert them to become Lincolnians. The task is to show them that Lincoln was an option presented to the American people, an option that he worked diligently to present. There were other options on the table. Douglas, far superior in terms of his own political expertise, experience, following, et cetera. Stephen Douglas. Yeah. And then, of course, Breckinridge and the Southern Democrats. So what I do in this class is I say, look, I could teach you a class on Lincoln and all we do is read Lincoln. You'd be pretty good, but you wouldn't be great. I want you to be great. And to be great, you have to see his opponents. You have to see how articulate the pro-slavery position was rendered. You read the farewell address of Jefferson Davis, Mississippi senator, explaining why he's not going to show up to work the next day because of what his state has decided to do, secede. You read the secession ordinances, right? You read, did I mention Calhoun yet? It's always South Carolina. What is up with that? You read Calhoun, 1837, 1848, 1850, the godfather of the positive good theory of slavery, good for the master and the slave. And then you read Douglas. That was the threat, not Calhoun. Douglas was the threat. I mean, Calhoun dies in 50, but it's Douglas tempting people who have no intentions whatsoever of owning a person, ever. My people never owned slaves, that whole crowd. That's the threat, Lincoln says. These are people who are becoming tempted into thinking that, oh, yeah, only white people signed the Declaration. I guess it's like that proto-George Wallace position. So as I tell them ad nauseum, my job as a professor is to make it a fair fight. Make it a fair fight. And so if I think Lincoln is all that, well, who were the strongest opponents of Lincoln? In other words, what was it that the American people were watching when they chose Douglas instead of Lincoln in 1858? And then Lincoln makes sure that the debates are published as a book in the following year. Why does he do that? Right? Why does he travel all the way first to Beecher's church? They have so many people buying tickets, they move it to Cooper Institute. Why is he giving a speech way over in New York? And then on the way back, as the great Michael Burlingame puts it, he does this victory lap through the New England states. He continues to introduce himself to the American people. Hey, you're running for president? No, I'm not standing for president. Yes, I am. I'm not running for president. I don't think I'm worthy, blah, blah, blah. He's positioning himself to be the second choice of people if they can't go with their favorite son. So I want my students to see that none of this is a fait accompli. None of this is, like watching the Titanic and knowing how it ends. With Lincoln, we know how it ends. I'm trying to get them to watch this in real time, in the same way you teach Douglas. 1847, that 1852 speech, that's his coming out speech. He announced in 50, I'm going to change my opinion, but I'm not yet sure about this Constitution thing, but I'm no longer willing to leave it in the hands of the pro-slavery dudes. And so in 1852, that's when he says publicly for the first time, in a sense, I'm no longer a Garrisonian. I'm in both feet, Constitution, pro-freedom, and these are the reasons why, and it freaks Garrison out. But that speech is super important for a number of reasons.
Well, that is our time. Let's thank our panelists and thank all of you for joining us today.